I'm Mara Duncan, 32. And the first thing I remember after my 9-hour spinal surgery was the weight of my phone in my hand and the blur of 68 missed calls coming into focus. My throat still burned from the tube when my father's voice filled the room. Sounding almost cheerful as he said he hoped, I was waking up well because he and my mother had already taken care of something important for the family. He explained that they had sold my townhouse, signed the papers on my behalf, and moved the money to cover Tessa's wedding expenses, as if he were telling me he'd picked up groceries on the way home. I whispered his words back to myself, trying to decide if the anesthesia was twisting them. But the voicemail kept playing, steady and certain, insisting I would understand once I was fully awake. The nurse asked if I needed water, and I forced myself upright enough to listen again as he said, "You weren't in any condition to sign." So we stepped in. And it's done. I felt the hospital mattress tilt when I answered him under my breath. "You forged my name." The nurse paused, unsure if I was speaking to her. And I shook my head and told her I was fine, even though my pulse was hammering hard enough to make the monitor blink red. I replayed his message a third time until each word landed exactly the same, leaving no room for misinterpretation. That was the moment I understood I hadn't woken into recovery. I had woken into a different life. When the nurse stepped out to update my chart, I called Frank with my voice still raspy, and he answered with a bright, "There you are," as if we were catching up after brunch rather than after my surgery. I told him I had heard the voicemail, and he said, "Good. Then you know we handled the townhouse since you couldn't." And the calm in his tone made my stomach twist. I asked him why he thought he could sign my name, and he exhaled like I was being unreasonable before saying, "It was a family decision, Mara, and you'll see it was the right one once Tessa's day comes together." I didn't raise my voice when I said, "You forged my signature." And he went silent long enough for me to hear him shift the phone before muttering, "Don't make this dramatic." I told him it wasn't drama, it was the law. And he snapped back that I had a good job and would recover the loss without trouble. But Tessa only had one wedding. My chest tightened as I reminded him that the townhouse was the only thing I owned outright. And he cut me off with, "You weren't even living there much. So stop acting like this is theft." I felt the incision in my back ache as I said, "It is theft." And he replied, "If you talk to me like I'm some criminal, this conversation is over." Before ending the call, the room felt smaller when the line went dead, and the monitor beside me steadied itself again, as if my body was waiting for permission to react. I called my mother next, and when she answered with a clipped Mara, "Your father is upset," I told her I understood why after what they had done. She sighed sharply and said, "We borrowed against your stability for your sister's future." As though rearranging the words could change the meaning, I repeated the phrase "borrowed against my stability." And she insisted there was no need to turn this into a fight because the papers were already filed and the funds were already gone. I told her I was still lying in a hospital bed, and she replied, "Then focus on healing and let us handle the rest," before hanging up without waiting for my response. 4 days after I was discharged, I sat on my couch with my back braced and called Ryan Bradford. And he didn't waste time before saying, "Mara, the signature on that power of attorney isn't yours. Not even close," while I pressed the phone tighter against my ear to steady myself. He explained that the notary stamp belonged to someone already under review for improper filings. And when I asked if the sale could be reversed, he answered, "Not easily, because the buyer acted in good faith, and the transaction has already cleared." I told him my parents had treated my absence as permission, and he replied, "What they treated it as was an opportunity. And that's a different thing entirely." I asked him to send every document he had, and he said he would overnight the packet so I could see for myself what had been done. When I hung up, Ellen knocked once and stepped inside, holding a folded piece of paper, saying she had something she should have given me sooner. She sat across from me and placed the note in my hand. And the inked lines confirmed it was written by my father because his slanted lowercase f was unmistakable. She said she found it in a stack of receipts after he visited her a month earlier. And the words "use her assets when she's out for surgery" stared back at me with a clarity that made my breath thin. I asked Ellen why she kept it. And she answered, "Because I knew you'd need proof one day." And the weight of the paper felt heavier than anything I had lifted since the operation. Ryan arrived that afternoon with a folder tucked under his arm. And before he even sat down, he said, "Mata, if you want to pursue criminal charges, you have the grounds." While I told him I wasn't looking to put my parents in court, but I wasn't letting the sale stand untouched. He opened the folder and pointed to the notarization line, saying, "This stamp has already been challenged twice this year, so any judge will see the pattern." And I asked him what options remained for someone who had lost a property without consent. He answered that civil action could recover damages but not the townhouse itself. And when I said, "Then the wedding is where the truth has to land," he nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that choice from the moment he heard my voice. I told him he would need to be available on the day of the ceremony. And he said, "Send me the time and address, and I'll be standing by." After he left, Ellen brewed tea she knew I wouldn't drink and told me she'd been waiting for years for the moment my parents pushed too far. I told her I wasn't interested in revenge, only in ending the pattern that followed me from childhood into adulthood. And she said, "Patterns don't end until someone refuses to keep playing their part." I reached for the envelope holding the deed to my parents' house in Utah, the one I had bought through an LLC to keep them from losing everything. And when she saw it, she asked if I was prepared for what it meant to use it. I told her I hadn't saved that house to weaponize it, but I also hadn't saved it for them to turn around and take mine. She leaned closer and asked what I planned to say when the room went quiet at the wedding. And I answered that I would show them exactly what they signed, exactly what they sold, and exactly who paid the price for their choices. She warned me that Sandra would break before Frank did, and I said I wasn't aiming to break anyone, just to put the truth in a place no one could look away from. She asked if Tessa knew anything about the townhouse beyond the excuse she'd repeated online, and I told her I intended to find that out in person. Ellen placed her hand on mine and said, "Then we go in together." And I nodded because there was no version of this confrontation where I walked in alone. Ellen drove me to the rehearsal dinner in Salt Lake City. And when I eased myself out of the car with the stiffness that still lingered from surgery, she asked if I was sure I wanted to walk in. And I told her, "If I don't show up now, they'll believe I won't show up at all." Inside the private dining room, Sandra looked me over and said, "You should have stayed home if you're still hurting." And I answered that I was managing fine, until she added, "Pain gets worse when you let things bother you." Which made me say, "Then you must be in agony after forging my name." The table went quiet for a beat before she murmured, "We did what had to be done." And I took my seat without acknowledging the glare that followed me. Tessa arrived late, brushing past chairs as she told everyone the florist had made a mistake with her bouquet. Then she saw me and said, "I didn't think you'd come." Considering everything, I told her I wasn't there to make a scene. And she replied, "Then maybe don't start one," while she lifted a glass she hadn't touched long enough for condensation to bead at the rim. I asked her if she understood what selling the townhouse meant. And she said, "It meant helping the family when you wouldn't," which made Jared shift in his chair before asking her, "Did you know about the signature?" She shot him a quick look and said, "I don't get involved in paperwork," while he kept his eyes on her a moment longer than she liked. When dinner ended, Frank tapped his glass and spoke about sacrifice, pausing just long enough to glance my direction before turning back to the room with a practiced smile. I stood slowly and told him I didn't recall volunteering anything. And he murmured, "Don't start this here." While I answered that I wasn't starting anything, only reminding him what he'd taken. Jared walked by as guests gathered their things, and he lowered his voice to say, "If there's something you think I should know, tell me." But I told him the time for explanations would come soon enough. As Ellen and I stepped out into the hallway, she whispered that Tessa's hand had shaken when my name was mentioned. And I said, "Good. Then she knows I'm done pretending not to see what's right in front of me." Ellen and I arrived at the Utah Mountain Lodge just as guests streamed toward the ceremony space. And she whispered that I didn't owe anyone grace while I told her I needed clarity. Not grace. When I took my seat in the last row, Sandra looked back and murmured to someone. She always chooses the dramatic entrance. And I leaned toward Ellen long enough to say, "If sitting in the back is dramatic, imagine how they'll handle the truth." Tessa walked past in her gown, pretending not to see me until she got close enough to say, "Don't ruin what isn't about you." And I answered quietly, "If you wanted it to stay about you, you shouldn't have touched what was mine." The officiant began their vows, and the applause rose around me like a wave I had no intention of standing in. During the reception, Frank grabbed a microphone and said, "Family sacrifice is what built this day." And several people clapped until he added, "Even Mara supported us more than she realizes," which made his smile feel more like a warning. I walked forward before he could continue and said, "If you're thanking me, tell them what you took." While he hissed, "Mara, not here," through a grin that begged the room to stay relaxed. I told the guests that 6 weeks earlier, I had been unconscious in surgery while my parents sold my townhouse using a forged power of attorney. And the chatter dropped off as if someone had shut a door. Sandra murmured, "This isn't appropriate." And I replied, "Neither was emptying my life to fund a wedding." Tessa stepped toward me, clutching her bouquet, and said, "You're doing this because you can't stand that today isn't yours." But I told her that lies didn't become truth just because she repeated them loudly. I pulled the folded note from my purse and read the line about using my assets when she's out for surgery. And Frank snapped, "You don't get to read that?" While Jared stared at him and asked, "You wrote those words," I said. "The buyer acted legally, but my parents hadn't." And several guests turned to the head table with faces tight enough to show they already knew where their sympathy no longer belonged. When I placed the copy of the deed to their Utah home beside the documents and said, "I saved your house 5 years ago," Sandra whispered, "We never knew." And I answered, "You never asked." Jared stepped beside Tessa and asked, "Did you know any of this was happening?" And the tremor in her reply, "I knew parts," cracked whatever illusion the evening had left. I told the room I had no intention of ruining a celebration, only of placing the truth where no one could pretend it wasn't real. And not a single person moved to interrupt me. When I turned to walk back toward the rear tables, the aisle opened without anyone speaking, as if the silence itself had chosen a side. Ellen met my eyes with a nod as I sat again, and I understood the moment the applause ended that the wedding itself had already split into its before and after. Jared moved closer to Tessa after the room fell into its uneasy silence and asked how much she had known before today. And she kept her eyes on the floor while insisting she only knew fragments she never understood. I watched him measure the truth behind her voice as he told her fragments didn't explain forged signatures. And she answered that she had stayed out of anything involving documents because it wasn't her place. Frank stepped between them and announced that everything I showed was misleading. But I told him nothing was misleading when the dates, E-Day, signatures, and transactions lined up exactly with the day I was under anesthesia. Guests shifted in their seats as though the floor had tilted slightly beneath them. Frank reached for the papers again and muttered that he had been under impossible pressure. But I told him pressure never granted permission to sign a name that wasn't his. Sandra wiped at her cheek and said they believed I would recover the loss easily because I always managed to land on my feet. And I told her that losing my home had never been part of any version of managing. I opened the folder holding the deed to their Utah house and laid it beside the forged documents. And Sandra stared at it long enough for recognition to settle in her expression. She said she had never known I did that for them. And I told her I had done it because they were my parents. Not because I expected repayment. Jared turned back to Tessa and reminded her she had told him her family was unusually generous. And she whispered that they were generous. Just not in my direction. I told him I wasn't asking for sympathy. Only clarity. And he nodded once and said clarity mattered when someone was choosing who to build a life with. Frank attempted to regain control by saying the matter belonged in private. But I told him it stopped being private the moment they used my home to fund a wedding I never agreed to support. A few guests backed away from the head table as if they finally recognized where the fault line had been running all night. Sandra reached toward me and suggested we could resolve everything quietly. But I stepped back and told her quietly was exactly what had allowed this to happen. Frank accused me of turning the room against them. And I answered that the room didn't need my help to hear what was already undeniable. Tessa whispered that it was still her wedding day. And I told her the date on the calendar didn't change the truth she had chosen to stand beside. Jared let the bouquet slip from Tessa's hand as he backed away. And the lodge settled into a silence that felt like the moment after something finally breaks. Guests began leaving the lodge in small clusters after Jared stepped away from Tessa. And I heard one of Daniel's uncles mutter that there was nothing left to celebrate, while Sandra told him the family needed time to regroup. Frank stopped a couple near the doors and insisted the entire situation was exaggerated. But the woman shook her head and said forged documents didn't sound exaggerated at all. Tessa followed Jared into the hallway, calling his name and asking him not to let one moment destroy everything. And he answered that it wasn't one moment, but every detail lining up the same way. When he disappeared around the corner, she turned back toward the room with her hands trembling at her sides. Frank walked toward me with a strained smile and asked if I understood how difficult things would become for them after tonight. And I told him the difficulty had started long before this evening. He said families survived worse. But I reminded him families didn't usually steal homes from their own children. Sandra stepped between us and asked if there was any chance we could repair what had cracked open. And I told her nothing could be repaired until they admitted what they had chosen to do. She lowered her eyes as though the truth finally carried its actual weight. By the time I reached the porch outside, Jared was standing alone watching the lodge lights flicker against the snow. And he told me he didn't know how to process, learning the wedding had been built on my loss. I said he didn't owe me understanding. Only clarity about what he wanted next. And he nodded slowly as he said clarity was the only thing he trusted right now. Tessa stepped outside asking if he was coming back in for the photos. And he told her he wasn't stepping into any picture built on someone else's broken boundary. The wind moved between us in a thin, unsteady line as none of us spoke again. 3 weeks after the wedding, Frank called late in the afternoon asking if I planned to move forward with the eviction notice. And I told him the notice had already been filed the morning after the lodge reception. He said they just needed more time to figure out their next step. And I reminded him they had known for years that the house wasn't theirs. Sandra came on the line quietly, asking if there was any grace left in me. And I told her grace had carried me as far as it could. The silence on the phone felt like they finally believed what the papers had already confirmed. A few days later, Tessa showed up at my door saying she thought we could talk. And I told her talking had never been the problem, telling the truth had been. She said she panicked at the lodge because everything fell apart faster than she expected. And I answered that it fell apart exactly at the speed of what she built. She asked if I hated her. And I told her hatred required history we never shared. She stood there a moment before saying she hoped I eventually found peace. That same week, Jared met me for coffee near my office and said he kept replaying the moment I laid the documents on the table, trying to understand how someone could look at family and still take I told him I stopped trying to understand it long ago and only learned to respond. He said he respected the way I chose truth even when it turned the room. And I told him truth was the only thing that didn't collapse when everything else did. We sat quietly after that, neither of us needing the silence filled. When the 30 days ended, I walked through the empty Utah house and whispered that I hoped they found whatever they needed next. I locked the door behind me, knowing some stories don't mend, and some boundaries stay exactly where they're drawn. And when I stepped back into the sunlight, I felt the kind of steady quiet that finally belongs to me. When I closed the door behind me, I told myself this was the first step toward something steadier. And I hope you felt that shift with me. If my story stayed with you, you're welcome to subscribe for the next one I share. I'd be glad to have you here. Until then, take care.